The contrast between Syria before 2011 and the present day illustrates a country transformed by war, violence, and conflict. This transition has taken a deep toll on the human rights of the people of Syria, particularly that of women. Syria, which was once a land of hope and peace, has turned into a country known for acts of unimaginable cruelty against women. Today we'll uncover the brutality of the crimes against women in Syria since this civil war began, through survivor testimonies, expert analysis, and human rights reports. Let's explore the methods employed by Assad's forces, torture, and forced displacement, and how these acts, like all forms of violence against women, have not only caused physical injury, but psychologically damaged a generation of women. You might be wondering, how does a government that once claimed to have a high priority on women's rights turn into a government that is systematically deploying gender-based violence as the mode of oppression? Well, this video will shed light on that, so stay tuned until the end. Hit the like button and subscribe to Before Now. We'd love for you to be part of our journey. Your thoughts and experiences matter to us, so don't forget to leave a comment below. We're all in this together. Before 2011, Syrian women played integral roles in their communities as teachers, doctors, mothers, and activists, making up nearly half of the workforce. However, with the onset of the war under Bashar al-Assad, their lives were upended. Women became targets of brutality, with their gender weaponized as a tool of repression in a conflict that has devastated generations. How did this happen? The Syrian war, which began in 2011 as a peaceful uprising before escalating into one of the 21st century's most brutal conflicts, saw the systematic targeting of women become a deliberate and devastating tactic. Far from being collateral damage, reports from human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch highlight how violence were used to intimidate opposition groups, punish dissent, and instill fear in entire communities. Women were arrested unjustly, detained in security centers and prisons, and then preyed upon. These acts were not random, but a part of coordinated strategy. Survivors recount how violence was used during house raids and at checkpoints, turning daily life into a minefield of fear, with their bodies exploited to send a powerful message. Opposition to Assad would come at the highest personal cost. Imagine losing your dignity and your humanity, shoved into a dark cell filled with nothing, while fear and horror approach you from every angle. For women such as Muna Muhammad, an ex-music teacher who was arrested when she protested against President Bashar Assad in 2012, this was a reality. She was imprisoned in the Military Intelligence Branch 215, the very much revered branch of hell. Torture here is not merely an instrument of interrogation, but an instrument of terror to instill fear among the captives. Muna recalls how the threat was used to intimidate them, and the looming danger of further violence if they attempted to escape the abuse inflicted by Assad's forces. With the intensifying conflict, millions of Syrians were displaced within months and were often forced to leave their homes overnight. This fully explains why women were especially vulnerable during this displacement, as the majority traveled alone or with their children, which made them perfect targets for all sorts of exploitation. But in the refugee camps and along the dangerous escape routes, women such as Rima and Amina became trapped by human trafficking and forced marriages. An investigation that came to light recently showed that a number of these young women were forced to marry much older men who were either regime loyalists or militiamen in the name of protection. Such marriages often turned into a facade for exploitation. The toll of gender-based violence in the Syrian conflict extends far beyond the immediate physical harm. Survivors of rape and torture often face lasting psychological trauma, including PTSD, depression, and anxiety. In Syrian society, honor is often tied to a woman's body, and violence carries a stigma that isolates survivors. Many women were often faced rejection from their families or communities, compounding their suffering. Some were, however, pressured into silence to protect the family's honor. Others were ostracized with their stories erased from collective memory. This societal reaction played directly into the regime's hands, as it discouraged survivors from speaking out and allowed the cycle of violence to continue unchecked. Despite the fear and stigma, some survivors have come forward to share their stories, breaking the silence surrounding these atrocities. Organizations like the Syrian Network for Human Rights, or SNHR, and advocacy groups in exile have documented countless testimonies. Noura al-Ghizawi, a prominent Syrian activist, was deeply involved in the anti-government protests that erupted in Syria in 2011. Her activism began when she was just 17 years old, and she quickly became a key figure in organizing demonstrations against the Assad regime. In 2012, during one of these protests in Homs, she was arrested and subsequently detained for 3 months. During her time in custody, Noura endured severe torture, including psychological abuse aimed at breaking her spirit. She later recounted that the regime's goal was not just to inflict physical pain, but to destroy her will and sense of self. After her release, Noura continued her activism, focusing on helping victims of torture and advocating for human rights despite the trauma she experienced. Lama Lauren Jezri is another survivor who was arrested during protests in Aleppo in 2012 and again in 2014. She spent over 100 days in prison where she faced extreme torture, including abuse by guards. Lama described being forced to confess to crimes she did not commit, under duress and suffering severe physical and psychological trauma as a result of her detention. Ala al-Dari is another survivor who came forward amidst the stigma to share her story. Ala was detained shortly after the civil war began in 2011 and spent a year in various prisons where she endured horrific torture. She suffered a heart attack due to the brutality, but was re-imprisoned after receiving medical treatment. Like many other women released from Assad's prisons, Ala faced persistent psychological trauma and societal rejection upon her return home. Also, Mohammed, who lives in the eastern Ghouta regions of Damascus, recounted that while she was going to work one morning in 2012, having covered even her face with her headscarf, regime forces forced her into a car, took her to a detention center, and beat her. After being interrogated 3 times and being placed in a room with 7 other female detainees, Mohammed said her headscarf was forcefully taken off. You could read on everyone's face in the room that they were being exposed to torture. There was a girl in the 9th grade. She was raped by 6 people in front of everyone. The girl was from a very religious family. They took her elsewhere, but she never came back. If she were alive, she would have come back, Mohammed said. Mohammed said she resisted when they violently pulled off her headscarf. For this very reason, I was tortured. I was in front of everybody. Even a 55-year-old woman was. 5 or 6 days after she was arrested, Mohammed said she was placed in solitary confinement and spent about 2.5 months with little bread and some cheese given to her every 10 days. She got severely sick and her nervous system collapsed because of what she endured. She related that a heavily built person would come into her cell and beat her until she passed out. It is no doubt that the trauma faced by these women extends far beyond physical violence, encompassing psychological scars that affect their mental health and social standing. But as we reflect on this painful history, it's important to remember that these women are individuals with stories that deserve to be told. As we wrap up this episode, it's important that we acknowledge not only the suffering endured, but also the resilience displayed by countless Syrian women who continue to fight for their rights amidst adversity. Their stories remind us that while justice may seem elusive today, awareness and advocacy can pave the way toward accountability and healing. By understanding these narratives, we can contribute to a broader dialogue about women's rights in conflict zones around the world. Thank you for joining us today. If you found this episode enlightening, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Before Now for more intriguing content. Together, we can amplify these voices that need to be heard.